Bikers ripped an old veteran's shirt, but his Delta Force tattoo shocked everyone. The door of the Rusty Spoke creaked open, and the night spilled in with the roar of engines still echoing outside. The patrons, mostly weary locals, looked up as a wall of leather and steel-toed boots swept into the bar. At the front of the pack strode Savage, the towering leader of the Rust Motorcycle Club, his beard braided with metal beads that clinked with every step. His eyes scanned the room until they locked onto a man behind the counter, Jim. To the bikers, Jim looked unremarkable. 42 years old, shoulders a little stooped, hair trimmed short but graying at the temples. He wore a plain plaid shirt rolled up at the sleeves, pouring beers with a quiet rhythm, as if nothing in the world could rattle him. To Savage, that calm was an invitation. He wanted to break it. "Bartender," Savage's voice thundered, making a glass tremble on the counter. "We're claiming this place now. You want it safe? You pay $1,000 a week, or we make sure nobody in this town drinks in peace again." The room froze. A couple of farmers in the corner exchanged uneasy glances, but no one spoke. Jim set down the glass he was holding, wiped his hands on a rag, and looked Savage in the eye. "No deal," he said quietly. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried, steady as stone. Savage's lips curled into a sneer. He stepped closer, towering over Jim. "What did you say to me, old man?" "I said no," Jim repeated. Laughter erupted from the bikers, cruel and mocking. Savage grabbed Jim by the shirt front and with a violent rip tore the fabric open. The laughter died instantly. Across Jim's chest, ink burned into skin years ago, stared back at them. A winged dagger, the Latin words De Oppresso Liber, curved beneath it, the emblem of Delta Force. Silence swallowed the room. The air grew heavy. On Jim's scarred torso, each mark told a story of battles fought in places no map would mark. Savage's hand trembled where it clutched the torn shirt. For the first time that night, he wasn't laughing. The question lingered in every stunned mind. Who exactly was this man they thought was just a bartender? The Rusty Spoke sat on the edge of a quiet highway, a low-slung building of weathered wood and neon glow. Its sign flickered with the stubborn persistence of a heart that refused to quit. Inside, the bar was a refuge for men and women who had seen better days. Truckers with calloused hands, farmers with dust still clinging to their boots, and the occasional drifter nursing a beer for hours. The air always smelled faintly of bourbon, fried food, and the lingering smoke from Marlboros stubbed out in the cracked ashtrays lining the counter. On most nights, the hum of a jukebox filled the room with old country ballads, songs about broken hearts and long roads. Tonight, that music had been silenced by the heavy boots of the Rust Motorcycle Club. Their presence sucked the warmth from the room, leaving only the cold taste of fear. Behind the counter stood Jim, short for James Carter, though few called him that anymore. To most of the town, he was just the man who kept the taps flowing, the one with a soft word for strangers and a steady hand when the place grew rowdy. He never raised his voice, never drank more than a single glass of beer after closing, and never talked much about himself. His quietness blended into the backdrop of the bar, just another piece of furniture, dependable and unassuming. But if you looked closely, you'd notice details that didn't quite fit the picture of a simple bartender. The way his eyes tracked every corner of the room at once, like a man who couldn't stop reading threats. The faint tension in his posture, the way his hands moved with the precision of someone who had been trained to do everything quickly, efficiently, and without wasted motion. The scars on his knuckles and forearms, pale lines carved by blades and bullets, now hidden most days beneath rolled-up sleeves. For years, locals whispered about Jim's past. Some said he had worked on oil rigs, others guessed prison. A few old-timers swore they'd seen him at military funerals, standing silent at the back, his shoulders squared in a way that betrayed more than a passing acquaintance with the uniform. Jim never confirmed or denied. When asked directly, he simply shook his head. That was another life, he'd say. The Rust Motorcycle Club knew none of this. To them, Jim was just another face in a town of nobodies. Savage, the gang's leader, lived off fear. He was a hulking brute with tattoos crawling up his neck and arms like black snakes, his leather vest patched with skulls and slogans meant to terrify. His reputation stretched across counties: extortion, bar fights, drug runs. The police were too intimidated or too compromised to intervene. Wherever Savage went, businesses closed their doors or paid tribute to survive. At his side loitered a half-dozen lieutenants: Crow, with his jagged smile and broken nose; Tank, a human mountain who wore brass knuckles like wedding rings; and Stitch, whose hobby was carving scars into those who resisted. Together, they prowled the bar like wolves, their laughter sharp and merciless. Tonight, though, their mockery faltered when Jim's shirt was torn away. The Delta Force tattoo glared at them like a warning carved in fire. In the corner, an older man set down his glass with trembling hands. His name was Harold Briggs, once a captain in the Army decades ago, now retired to the quiet life of a rancher. He leaned forward, eyes narrowing as recognition dawned. He had heard the rumors, but the proof lay bare before him now. "My God," Harold muttered, his voice low but audible. "Gray Ghost." The name cut through the silence. Heads turned. Some patrons gasped softly, others whispered. To those who had served or knew someone who had, the nickname meant something more than legend. The Gray Ghosts were whispered about in special forces circles, men who slipped through the dark unseen, who completed missions that never made it into official records. They were the soldiers sent in when failure wasn't an option and survival was uncertain. Savage's sneer faltered. He looked down at Jim, whose calm hadn't wavered even as his chest was exposed. Jim simply met his gaze, his blue-gray eyes as steady as granite. No anger, no fear, just the quiet presence of someone who had faced monsters far worse than a biker gang in a bar. And yet, Jim wasn't here to boast or terrify. He poured himself a small glass of water, drank slowly, and set it down with deliberate calm. His voice, when it came, was quiet. "This is a place for peace. You're free to drink, but no one here will pay you to pretend to protect them." The tension thickened. Patrons who had cowered moments before now leaned forward, caught between awe and dread. Savage's gang shifted uneasily, their bravado shaken. For the first time, doubt crept into the room, doubt about who truly held power here. But Savage wasn't ready to back down. His pride demanded blood, and Jim's refusal had become a challenge he couldn't ignore. The stage was set, though no one in the Rusty Spoke yet knew that the night would be etched into their memories forever. Savage's laugh returned, sharp and jagged, though it no longer rang with the same certainty. "So the bartender's a tough guy," he said, raising his voice so the whole room could hear. "A tattoo and some old scars don't mean anything. You think you can stand against me?" His lieutenants barked laughter, forcing it louder than they felt. Crow slammed his empty glass down on the counter. He's just hiding behind old ink. Delta Force or dishwasher, he's still just one man. Jim didn't rise to the bait. He picked up the broken remnants of his shirt and folded them neatly, setting them aside as though Savage had done no more than tear a bar rag. His silence was infuriating, because silence gave no ground to the bully's power. "Answer me when I talk to you," Savage bellowed. He grabbed a half-full pitcher of beer and dumped it across the counter, drenching the floor and Jim's boots. Foam spread across the wood like a stain of disrespect. Still, Jim didn't flinch. He simply reached for a towel and began wiping the counter clean, his movement steady, measured. The bikers erupted in cruel laughter. Tank shoved over a stool with a crash. Stitch leaned close to a young waitress and whispered something vile in her ear, sending her stumbling back in disgust. The room filled with the sound of intimidation, boots stomping, glasses breaking, voices jeering. But in that storm, Jim's calm stood out like a lighthouse in the dark. He finished wiping the counter, wrung the towel dry, and folded it. Only then did he look up at Savage. His voice was quiet, almost gentle. "You're scared." The words cut through the noise like a blade. Savage's face flushed, his neck veins straining. "What did you say?" "You're scared," Jim repeated, louder now so everyone could hear. "You came in here with your pack because you don't know how to stand alone." Gasps rippled through the bar. Savage lunged forward, grabbing Jim by the collar. For a moment, it seemed violence would erupt, until Jim's hand closed over Savage's wrist. He didn't twist, didn't strike. He simply held it, and somehow Savage, the giant of a man, froze. It was as though his arm had been locked in place by an invisible vice. His sneer faltered, his eyes flicking down to the scars and strength in Jim's grip. Jim released him, deliberately, like a teacher dismissing a foolish student. The gesture was more humiliating than a punch would have been. Savage stumbled back a step, trying to mask it as a choice, but everyone in the bar had seen it. Crow tried to rally the gang's bravado. He just got lucky, a trick grip. But his words were thin, unconvincing. Harold Briggs, the retired captain, stood slowly from his stool. His voice carried the authority of a man who had once commanded troops. "That's no trick," he said. "That's control. That's discipline. You boys don't even know what kind of storm you're poking." Savage snarled at Harold. "Sit down, old man, before I—" Before he could finish, Jim stepped out from behind the bar. For the first time, the bikers saw his full frame, not towering, not monstrous, but built like a machine honed for survival. His movements were fluid, balanced, every step placed with intent. The scars on his arms and chest caught the neon glow, each one a chapter of pain, endured and overcome. "You want to fight?" Jim asked softly. "Then hit me, right here, one-on-one." The challenge hung in the air. Savage's pride demanded he accept, but something in Jim's eyes made his stomach churn. It wasn't anger. It was certainty. Savage had spent his life feeding off fear. Jim had faced fear until it lost its hold. Savage clenched his fists, but his hesitation was plain. Around him, the silence of the patrons pressed like judgment. The bikers shifted, their smirks fading into unease. Finally, Savage spat on the floor, trying to reclaim ground. "You're not worth the blood on my knuckles." The words fooled no one. Everyone knew what they had just witnessed. Savage backing down. The mighty Rust Motorcycle Club silenced by a bartender's calm and a single grip. But humiliation, once seated, festers. Savage's pride burned hotter than ever, and though he retreated to his table, his eyes promised this wasn't finished. He would not allow himself to be shown up in front of his gang or his enemies in town without revenge. The night wore on, the jukebox silent, the air thick with unspoken tension, and Jim, quietly, picked up the pieces as though nothing had happened. Yet every soul in the Rusty Spoke knew everything had changed. The bikers lingered in the Rusty Spoke like a storm cloud refusing to break. But Jim's mind had already slipped elsewhere. The flash of Savage's hand tearing his shirt, the sudden reveal of the dagger and wings tattoo, it all had cracked open memories he had spent years burying under layers of routine, bourbon, and silence. He stood behind the bar long after the gang had retreated to their corner, polishing glasses no one had ordered, his reflection staring back at him through the curve of the glass. To the others in the room, he looked calm. Inside, he was already drifting backward in time. He was 21 again, standing on a rain-soaked parade ground at Fort Bragg. The instructors' voices thundered against his skull, their words blending into a single, merciless command. Push harder, run farther, break, and build again. His body trembled on the edge of collapse, but something inside refused to quit. De oppresso liber, they said, the motto of Special Forces, to free the oppressed. It wasn't just words to him. It was a creed that sank into his bones. He remembered nights when exhaustion blurred the edges of reality. One slip, one stumble, and a man would be gone, swallowed by the mud and darkness. But Jim endured, fueled not by glory, but by a promise. His father had been a veteran too, a man broken by war, whose silence and drinking had hollowed their family. Jim swore he would face the fire and come back whole, or not at all. From Fort Bragg to the world's hidden corners, he carried that oath. He became part of an elite group whispered about even among soldiers, the Gray Ghosts, men who appeared where they were least expected and disappeared before their enemies knew what had happened. They weren't on official rosters. Their missions lived only in shadows, spoken of in quiet bars and campfires where veterans gathered. One mission rose above the rest in his memory, branded on him like the scars across his torso. Afghanistan, 2003. His team had been dropped into the Shahikot Valley to dismantle a weapons pipeline funding insurgents. The valley was a labyrinth of caves and ambush points. The team moved like smoke, clearing hideouts, disabling caches. But then the ambush came, an avalanche of gunfire and mortars that turned night into chaos. Jim had led his men through it, his voice steady, even as the world roared. He remembered dragging Corporal Harris, his youngest teammate, out of a collapsing cave, his hands shredded on the rocks. He remembered the weight of Sergeant Lopez, mortally wounded, whispering with his last breath, "Make it count, Ghost." Jim had to leave him behind when the extraction bird arrived. That guilt never left. For his actions, for the lives he saved, Jim was given medals. They sat now in a shoebox in the back of a closet, collecting dust. To the world, he was a hero. To himself, he was a man who carried the faces of those who never came home. Back in the Rusty Spoke, the murmur of conversation crept back into the air. A hand touched Jim's arm. It was Harold Briggs, the retired captain. His eyes glistened with recognition and memory. "I knew it was you," Harold said quietly, his voice trembling. "I'd heard the stories, the ghosts. They said you didn't make it out." Jim offered a weary smile. "Ghosts aren't meant to be seen. Better for everyone if they think we're gone." "But why here? Why bartending in a place like this?" Harold asked. Jim's gaze drifted to the shelves of bottles, each one reflecting faint glimmers of light. "Because peace isn't something you find on a battlefield. It's in small places, Harold, in keeping things steady, in giving people a corner of the world where they can sit without fear." Harold nodded, understanding more than most would. He knew what it meant to need peace, to carve it out with your own hands after a life of chaos. But Savage's gang didn't care about peace. They saw weakness in restraint. And Jim knew it was only a matter of time before they tested him again. Later that night, after the bikers had finally left, Jim walked home under the cold starlight. The road stretched empty, the silence broken only by the crunch of gravel under his boots. He carried with him the weight of memory, faces of men lost, echoes of gunfire, the sting of smoke and sand. His small house sat at the edge of town, plain as he was. Inside, the walls were bare except for one photograph, his old team, lined up in dusty uniforms, smiles thin but proud. He touched the frame, his fingers tracing the face of Lopez. "I'm still trying to make it count," he whispered. He opened the shoebox. Inside lay the medals, dull against the cardboard. Next to them, folded carefully, was the last letter Lopez had written to his family, one Jim had carried out of the valley. He'd delivered it himself years ago, standing on a widow's porch with a silence heavier than any speech. That night, Jim sat with the shoebox open, listening to the distant rumble of motorcycles fading into the hills. He knew Savage would be back. Men like him couldn't abide humiliation. They would come louder, harder, determined to break what had stood against them. Jim closed the box and returned it to the closet. His scars ached, but his resolve hardened. He had wanted nothing more than a quiet life, but life had a way of pulling him back into the light he avoided. The ghost in him wasn't gone. It was waiting, silent, patient, ready if called upon. And now it had been. The next Friday night, the Rusty Spoke was busier than usual. Word had spread like wildfire through the small town. The night the bartender stood his ground against the Rust Motorcycle Club. Some came out of curiosity, others from loyalty, and a few just to see if the legend of Gray Ghost Jim was real. The jukebox played low, but the hum of conversation carried an edge of nervous energy. Every time a motorcycle roared past outside, glasses paused halfway to lips. Every face turned toward the door. At 9:30, the sound everyone dreaded rolled in. A storm of engines, louder this time, heavier, as though Savage had called in reinforcements. The double doors swung open and the gang flooded in, their boots thudding like war drums. Savage stood taller than the rest, rage barely hidden behind a smirk. "Evening, bartender," he growled, his voice dripping venom. "Heard you've been running your mouth, making me look weak." The bar went silent. Patrons froze in their seats. Jim polished a glass, set it down, and stepped out from behind the counter. His eyes didn't waver. His steps were steady, deliberate, the kind of calm that made men nervous. "You made yourself look weak," Jim said, his voice even. The words struck harder than a punch. Savage's smirk twitched into a snarl. He shoved past a stool, sending it clattering. "You think a tattoo makes you untouchable? I've buried tougher men." "No," Jim said. He took another step closer, his presence expanding, filling the room. What makes me untouchable is that I've already lived through hell. You don't scare me, Michael." The name, his real name, slammed into Savage like a fist. His gang exchanged uneasy glances. Few people knew their leader's birth name, and hearing it spoken aloud stripped away the armor of his persona. Savage's face darkened. "You don't get to call me that," he hissed. "I know more about you than you want them to know," Jim continued. "You weren't always Savage. You were just Michael, a scared kid who ran from his past and built this mask. But masks crack." The room was deathly still. Savage's fists clenched, his pride demanding retaliation. But Jim's words had already done the damage. He wasn't just standing up to Savage, he was dismantling him in front of his own men. Then Jim took one final step, closing the distance until only inches separated them. His voice dropped, low but sharp as steel. "You want to prove yourself? Drop the gang, drop the threats. Face me, just you and me." A murmur swept the room. Even the gang shifted uneasily, unsure whether to cheer or intervene. Savage's jaw tightened, sweat glistening at his temple. For the first time, he couldn't laugh, couldn't bluff. The challenge had been laid bare. Jim hadn't raised a fist, but the entire bar felt the shift. He was no longer just the quiet bartender. They all saw the soldier, the ghost, the man who had faced death and come back standing, and Savage, for the first time, was the one who looked small. The silence inside the rusty spoke thickened until it felt like the air itself was holding its breath. Savage's men shifted restlessly, their bravado evaporating under the weight of what had just been spoken. Jim stood motionless, his chest scarred, his eyes steady. The man they thought was just a bartender had drawn a line that no one dared cross without trembling. Savage broke first. His pride roared louder than his fear. "You think you can call me out?" he snarled, ripping off his leather vest and tossing it to the floor. His chest was covered in crude tattoos, skulls, flames, the patchwork of violence. "Fine. You want me one-on-one? Let's dance, Ghost." The bikers circled instinctively, forming a ring. The patrons of the Rusty Spoke shrank back against the walls, caught between dread and fascination. No one left. They all knew they were about to witness something unforgettable. Jim rolled his shoulders once, loosening muscles that had not been tested in years, but still remembered. "Outside," he said quietly. "I don't want blood on this floor." Savage barked a laugh, eager to reclaim his dominance. "Afraid to stain your bar, old man?" Jim didn't answer. He turned and walked through the doors into the gravel lot, the night air heavy with the scent of gasoline and dust. One by one, the bikers and patrons followed until the glow of headlights cast the circle. Engines idled like hungry beasts rumbling in the dark. Savage stomped into the circle, fists clenched, shoulders rolling. "You're nothing but scars and stories," he shouted. "Let's see how much fight is left in you." Jim stepped forward. His stance was simple, economical, no wasted motion, no posturing. Those who knew combat recognized it immediately. Harold Briggs, watching from the crowd, whispered, "God help him, that's not a bartender, that's a Delta operator." Savage charged first, throwing a haymaker meant to end it quickly. But Jim slipped aside with the smallest pivot of his foot, his body flowing like water. Savage's fist cut air, his momentum carrying him forward. Jim's hand tapped the back of his shoulder, redirecting him just enough that the gang leader stumbled. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Savage whirled and raged and swung again. 2, 3 wild punches. Each time Jim moved just out of reach, his calm infuriating his eyes, never leaving Savage's. Not once did he strike back. He didn't need to. Finally, Savage lunged with both arms, trying to grapple. Jim's body twisted, his elbows slipping under, his hips shifting with practiced precision. In one seamless motion, Savage was lifted and dropped onto the gravel with a crash that rattled teeth. Dust rose around him, and the crowd erupted in shouts. Jim stepped back, giving him space. "Stay down," he said evenly, but Savage couldn't. His pride screamed louder than his bruised body. He pushed himself up, gravel embedded in his skin, blood at the corner of his mouth. Not done yet. He came again, slower now, desperation in his swing. Jim caught his wrist, twisted, and in a flash, Savage was face down, his arm locked behind him at an angle that promised pain if he resisted. Savage howled, the sound echoing into the night. The bikers froze. They had never seen their leader brought low, not like this. Jim's voice carried across the circle, calm but commanding, every syllable ringing with authority. "This ends now. No more threats, no more extortion. You don't set foot in this bar or this town again." Savage writhed, but Jim tightened the hold just enough to silence him. His voice dropped lower, meant only for the man beneath him. "Michael, I know who you were before all this, and I know the things you did to bury that boy, but you can't outrun yourself forever." The name again, Michael, landed like a stone in Savage's gut. His fight drained, not just from the lock, but from the unbearable truth of being seen. Jim released him and stepped back. Savage scrambled to his knees, gasping, his pride shredded in front of everyone who had once feared him. The gang looked on, waiting for orders that never came. Savage's eyes darted around the circle, desperate for support, but his men shifted uncomfortably. Crow muttered, "Boss," but his voice held no conviction. Tank looked at the ground. Stitch shook his head. The spell of fear had broken. Jim's chest rose and fell with steady breaths. He hadn't thrown a single punch, yet he had dismantled Savage completely. Not just his body, but the aura of power that kept his gang in line. "Pick up your leader," Jim told the bikers. "Take him and go. This place is off limits. For good." For a moment, no one moved. Then Tank bent down, hauling Savage up by the arm. Savage's glare burned with shame, but his silence said everything. Without a word, the bikers mounted their motorcycles. Engines roared, headlights flared, and one by one they peeled into the night, leaving only the fading thunder of exhaust behind. The crowd erupted, not in cheers, but in a stunned exhale. The fear had lifted, replaced by awe. Men who had cowered minutes earlier now stood taller. Women who had trembled now let their shoulders ease. The Rusty Spoke had become more than a bar that night. It was a sanctuary reclaimed. Harold Briggs stepped into the circle, his eyes shining. "I knew it," he whispered. "Gray Ghost." Jim looked at him, then at the crowd, then back toward the quiet bar. He pulled the remnants of his torn shirt tighter around his shoulders and said nothing. Words weren't needed. The message was clear. The ghost had returned, not for war, but for peace. Yet, in the silence that followed, every patron understood the truth. Should war ever come to their doorstep again, they had a protector. The night air still vibrated with the echo of departing motorcycles, but inside the circle of headlights, the silence was deafening. Savage stood hunched, his pride bleeding more than his cuts, dust clinging to the sweat on his face. For years, he had ruled through fear, through the illusion of invincibility. Tonight, that illusion had shattered. Tank and Crow tried to steady him, but their movements were hesitant, stripped of loyalty. Stitch muttered under his breath, "Never thought I'd see the day." His words weren't for Savage, but for the truth they had all just witnessed, that their leader was mortal and worse, humiliated. The townsfolk stepped closer now, no longer cowering in shadows. They looked at Jim differently, not just as the bartender who poured their drinks, but as the man who had pulled back the curtain on the bully that had haunted them. One farmer spat at the gravel where Savage had fallen. Another man, who had once paid protection money, crossed his arms with new resolve. Fear had flipped into contempt, and Savage felt it like knives. Jim, standing calm at the center, spoke again. His voice carried not just authority, but finality. "This is done. No more threats, no more games. You come back here, Michael, and you'll answer not just to me, but to everyone you've tried to break." The use of his real name cut Savage deeper than any lock or throw had. Michael. It dragged him out of the myth he'd built and shoved him into the dirt of who he really was, a frightened boy who had clawed his way into power through cruelty. His jaw worked, searching for words, but nothing came. The gang watched him with eyes that no longer shone with respect. Finally, Jim stepped closer, his shadow falling across Savage. He didn't raise a hand. He didn't need to. "Apologize," he said quietly. Savage blinked, stunned. "What?" "Apologize to them, to everyone you've tried to own." The demand hung heavy. The crowd leaned in, waiting. Savage's mouth opened, closed. For a man who had barked orders his whole life, the word was heavier than any fist. At last, broken and cornered, he croaked it out. I'm sorry." The people of the Rusty Spoke didn't cheer. They didn't need to. Their silence was louder than any roar, a verdict pronounced. Savage sagged, his shoulders collapsing inward. He was no longer a king of the road, no longer the terror of the county. He was just Michael again. Jim turned his back on him without fear, the final humiliation. To be ignored by the man he'd tried to destroy was worse than any defeat. That night, Savage left the Rusty Spoke not as a conqueror, but as a shadow of himself. His reign was over, and everyone knew it. Morning came slowly to the Rusty Spoke. Sunlight slanted through dusty windows, painting the floorboards gold. The bar smelled of coffee instead of whiskey, peace instead of fear. The night before still lingered in memory, but it had shifted from dread into something else, pride. Jim moved quietly behind the counter, repairing the stool Savage had knocked over. His hands worked steadily, as they had in combat, as they had in silence, every motion deliberate. The regulars trickled in, not for beer, but to see him, to thank him. They didn't speak of the fight directly, no one needed to, but their eyes carried gratitude, their nods carried respect. Harold Briggs entered last, his cane tapping on the wood. He studied Jim for a long moment before saying, "What you did last night, you didn't just stand up to them. You gave this whole town its spine back." Jim shook his head. "I just wanted peace." "And that's why it worked," Harold replied softly. Word spread faster than fire through dry grass. Within weeks, veterans from neighboring counties began stopping by. They left patches from old units, dog tags, photographs of friends who never came home. Jim let them hang the mementos on the walls. Slowly, the Rusty Spoke transformed. The neon still buzzed, the jukebox still played, but now the walls told stories of courage, sacrifice, brotherhood, It became a sanctuary, not just for drinking, but for remembering, for healing. Jim never sought to be a leader. He didn't deliver speeches or chase attention. He poured drinks, listened, and when someone's voice cracked under the weight of memory, he put a steady hand on their shoulder. That was enough. On a quiet evening, a young soldier fresh from deployment walked into the bar. His eyes were haunted, his movements restless. He sat at the counter, silent, until Jim slid a glass of water toward him. "You're safe here," Jim said. The soldier looked around at the patches, the photos, the quiet reverence of the place. His shoulders eased. For the first time in months, maybe years, he believed it. Jim leaned against the counter, gazing at the walls covered in stories. He had once run from his past, ashamed of what it had cost him. But here, in this small bar on the edge of town, he found that the past could be more than scars. It could be a foundation. Outside, the evening sun dipped low, casting the world in a warm glow. Jim exhaled, steady and calm. He was no longer just a ghost. He was a guardian of peace. And the Rusty Spoke, once just a bar, had become something sacred, a home